Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the last of our series of inaugural lectures this year. It's been a really exciting and fun, one of the highlights, I think, of the research year calendar, these lectures. And so we're going out on a bang with our Dean of our College of Development Economics and Finance and our Deputy Dean as well, who are both also professors in the economics department. They will be introduced by people who are close to them, who know their work better than I do even. I end up spending a lot of time with them in meetings, so it's very nice to be able to have the chance to sit back and learn more about their research. So just to say, for those of you who may not be from an academic background, the inaugural lecture is a major kind of rite of passage, I might say, for those of us who become professors. Some of us became professors a while ago, but we're catching up, and so we want to make sure that everyone who joins SOAS and becomes a professor has the chance to be to present their work to the community, but also to a broad audience. And I know many of you are here to support Elisa and Antonio, who are from other chapters and aspects of their life. So welcome to SOAS. We're going to start out this evening first by hearing from Elisa, and to introduce her is our neighbor, Professor Jasmine Gideon. Jasmine is a professor of global health and development at Birkbeck, next door, and she has a specific interest in the gendered political economy of health in Latin America and issues around health and migration. Prior to working at Birkbeck, she worked at the University of Manchester and the Nuffield Institute for Health, and also the University of Leeds. She has carried out consultancies for a wide range of development institutions, including PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, the Global Health 50/50, and UN Women. She's currently co-investigator of an Academy of Medical Science funded network called Understanding the Inequality Impacts of Health Public-Private Partnerships in Middle-Income Countries, with colleagues from Peru, Argentina, Brazil, India, and Kenya. And I think Elisa's been part of that work, so you'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute. And she's also now leading in a follow-up research project on PPPs in Brazil. She's also led an ESRC fund, a Global Challenges Research Fund network called Equalities in Public-Private Partnerships. I knew I was going to mess that up at one point. And was the co-investigator on a GCRF-funded network on Andean Network for Venezuelan Migrants. So Jasmine will come up and tell us a little bit more about the Elisa that she knows and get us warmed up for Elisa's talk, which will be on the private turn in development finance from Monterrey to Seville. Welcome, Jasmine.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you to Elisa for inviting me to speak on your behalf, or to introduce you rather. So I first met Elisa nearly 10 years ago when Professor Jeff Varg and colleagues at the London International Development Centre, or the LIDC, introduced her to me and Elaine Untilter, who's also here tonight, who's at UCL. And at the time, Elaine and I were developing some comparative work around PPP, so public-private partnerships in health and education. And the LIDC had given us some funding to organise a workshop to bring people together, and suggested that we invite Elisa and some other SOAS colleagues who were also working on PPPs, but in housing, transport and water. And that first workshop where we met was the start of what's been a fantastic 10 years of not only research collaboration, but also friendship and some fun along the way. Indeed, Ben Fine, who supervised Elisa's PhD and again is here tonight, commented to me that one of the most positive things about Elisa is that she's highly principled, but at the same time is a very compassionate and supportive, energetic, and the most loyal of friends and colleagues, with an enviable capacity for hard work of the highest quality. And I think this has been very apparent throughout the time that Elisa and I have worked together, and remains very much the case today. And working with Elisa has been a great privilege, and I feel that I've learnt a lot from her, and I don't just mean in the academic sense. Sadly, though, the LIDC no longer exists, and this also points to the shrinking of spaces for critical thinking around development issues, and of course the wider challenges now facing both the development and the university sectors. So an important feature of my work with Elisa is it has both built on and also built strong international as well as national collaborations. For example, as Laura just mentioned, the LIDC-funded workshop resulted in us submitting a successful bid to the ESRC to what became the EQUIPS network, so Equality in Public-Private Partnerships, which ran from 2017 to 2018. And we worked with colleagues in India and South Africa, and we looked at PPPs in health, education, housing and water. And out of that work, we published, Elaine and I co-edited a volume, Critical Perspectives on PPPs, and the book contains a very informative chapter by Elisa and Maria Jose Romero, who's also here tonight, where they critically reflect on how we can understand what constitutes a PPP and move beyond the use of PPPs as a mere buzzword, while understanding what PPPs tell us about the role of private finance in development. And this is obviously what Elisa's going to tell us more about tonight. So now we have more than 10 years of collaborative interdisciplinary research and networks of people engaged with critical research on development finance, and especially PPPs, and we very much hope this work will continue to flourish. And one of the things that was really special about the EQUIPS network was that it brought together a diverse group of scholars working from very different disciplinary perspectives, and allowed us to really reflect on what is the ongoing push for development finance in the form of PPPs and what this really means and how it's played out across different sectors. But it also brought together a group of people with a shared vision around collaborative ways of working and a commitment to research that draws attention to the importance of publicly financed services in health, education, etc., and the need for greater focus on the inequality impacts of PPPs, something which has tended to be overlooked by the World Bank and other international financial institutions. But perhaps one of the best things Elisa did within the network was to invite the South African scholar, Dr. Gilad Isaacs, who also got his PhD here at SOAS, to join EQUIPS. And as well as doing great scholarly work, Gilad has an incredible knowledge of great places to eat wherever you are in the world. So many of us were also able to build lasting friendships over dinner from this work. And at the same time, the EQUIPS network also enabled us to work across the Bloomsbury colleges and build our own more localised networks, as well as working with more junior colleagues. Along with Elaine, Elisa and I were able to develop 2 PhD studentships, one funded by the Bloomsbury Studentship Scheme and another funded through an ESRC collaborative award that was ultimately supervised by Elisa with Elaine. And both those PhD students, Dr. Maria Jose Romero and Dr. Lindsay Robinson, who are both here, have now successfully completed their PhDs, and they've continued to work in related areas. In fact, Maria Jose continues to be involved in our new research bids on PPPs that Elisa and I have been developing along with other colleagues, and including another of Elisa's ex-PhD students, Dr. Julia Chukwuma, who's also here. And other important UK-based colleagues who've worked with Elisa for a long time and have remained at the forefront of the work on PPPs and private finance include Dr. Kate Bayliss. And again, I'm thankful to Elisa for introducing me to Kate, as we've now been involved in several projects together, including expanding the PPP network to Latin America and working with a number of people and organisations in Peru and more recently Brazil, where we now have an Academy of Medical Science funded projects looking at PPP hospitals across Brazil, led by Professor Lena Lavinas, who again, Elisa facilitated the introduction when Lena was here as a visiting professorial scholar. But more recently, Elisa's taken on management responsibilities at SOAS, and some of this coincided with my own role as Assistant Dean of Geography at Birkbeck. But Elisa was always able to provide clear-sighted advice, and it was really great to have someone there to share the stresses and challenges of working in these kind of roles, but also knowing that her sharp insights would offer the right solutions to the problems. Yet, despite the heavy workload of her current role as Head of College of Development, Economics and Finance, Elisa remains committed to her research and supporting her past and present PhD students as well as colleagues. And so now I'd like to invite you to hear more about her work and ask you to join me in congratulating Elisa on her very well-deserved chair in Development Economics. So thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And thanks a lot, Jasmine, for these very kind words. It's a real pleasure for me to be here with all of you to celebrate my inaugural lecture. Let me, before I start on the actual lecture, let me do some preliminaries. And the least habit is one I inherited from my supervisor, Ben. So first, I'm so excited to share this moment, this particular occasion with Antonio. I have worked closely with Antonio over the last 3 years, and I'm continuously impressed by the energy he brings to his important mission of reaching deep into policy-making circles, creating networks and links that make relevant the important work that he and his colleagues do in the world beyond academia. I look forward to hearing your inaugural lecture, Antonio, and I'm humbled to share the platform with you. Second, I want to extend thanks to my friends and family who have been alongside me during the journey that has brought me here today. You know who you are, but I want to name my husband, Jawad, and my children, Kais and Zena. As many children of working mothers, Kais and Zena have to navigate the constraints imposed by my work and to negotiate the oftentimes tight availabilities of their mother. I must say that I'm impressed by how they are managing. Most recently, I overheard a conversation in which my daughter was advising my son on how to get me to assist him in buying clothes online. She told him, listen, if you want your mother's attention to buy clothes with you online, you have to prepare a PowerPoint presentation and present it to her on Saturday afternoon when she may have time for you. Very pragmatic. I'm also particularly appreciative that Zena has managed to join us here tonight as she meets GCSE exams with not 1 but 2 exams tomorrow. But let me express particularly deep gratitude to my husband, Jawad, who has accompanied me on my scholarly journey from the initial episodes of my doctoral studies to my chair that we celebrate here today. Our continuous exchanges on all matters work-related have allowed me to gain clarity in my academic contributions, as well as have enabled pause and reflection in my leadership roles. It's fair to say that without you, Jawad, I would not be the scholar that I am today. Third, and yes, we are still in the preliminaries, as you know, I am delivering this inaugural lecture while holding a leadership position in the institution. I have been Dean of the College of Development Economics and Finance for nearly 3 years. This foray into academic leadership started in August 2019, when together with my dear colleague, Hannah Bargawi, we decided to step into the role of co-heads of the economics department. We were the first to introduce a job-sharing head of department arrangement in the institution, and as we emerged from our appointment interview, Hannah joked, let's see if we'll still be friends in 3 years. Yes, I think we have successfully managed that challenge. Nearly 6 years on, and after having navigated together difficult institutional circumstances, including the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the transformation and change process here at SOAS, multiple changes in the leadership of the institution, we remain friends and close collaborators, with Hannah currently serving as Director of Global Teaching and Learning. Fourth, along this journey from co-head to dean, I have enjoyed working closely with my colleagues across the institution. Let me thank in particular the heads of the CoDEF departments, Alberto Asquer, Carlos Soya, and Satoshi Miyamura, the Deputy Dean of Teaching and Learning, Annabelle de Vries, the Deputy Dean, Research Knowledge Exchange, Antonio, and all the professional service colleagues with whom I work so closely, but in particular, the CoDEF College Manager, Matt Schofield. Finally, I hope to use this inaugural lecture as a way to pay tribute to all my fellow travelers, those who have enriched and clarified my analysis, including my students and colleagues. I have had multiple companions along the way. There is, of course, Ben Fine, on whom more later, as well as my close collaborators, whom Jasmine has already mentioned, Kate Baylis, Jasmine herself, Elaine Unterhalter, Jula Chukuma, and Maria Jose Romero. I hope for this inaugural to be a celebration of the work we do collectively in the scholarly sphere and beyond. With all that, indulge me as I use my lecture as a moment of reflection. My journey as a scholar started in the pre-Brexit era when I had come from Belgium as an Erasmus undergraduate finalist exchange student to the University of Bristol. I had chosen the elective on development economics at Bristol, and during one of the seminars, the lecturer did a brief overview of master's options in economics in the UK, including for those with an interest in development. During that quick overview, the lecturer referred to SOAS as having the only economics department that teaches Marxist political economy, combining this with a unique footprint in development via the anchor of its research and teaching in the regions of Asia and Africa. Aha! Given that during my undergraduate studies, which followed a very mainstream curriculum, I had been continuously struck by the perverse paradox between the power of economic ideas in public discourse and practices versus their failure to account for the world as it is, I was hoping that the Marxists, with their traditional interest in both ideology and real-world phenomena, were going to help me in finding answers. This was not just an academic question. The power of what I was soon to discover as flawed economic ideas has dramatic implications in the real world, as, for instance, austerity programs are enacted via cuts to government spending in large parts of the world, undermining delivery in health, education, transport, housing, etc., on the basis of tenuous economic propositions around the relationships, for instance, between debt and GDP, inflation and the money supply, or the functioning or lack thereof of markets. I arrived at SOAS and found the book entitled Economic Theory and Ideology on one of my reading lists. This book was by now Emeritus Professor in the Economics Department, Ben Fine, then Professor in the department, and soon to be PhD supervisor, mentor, and friend. Where is Ben? Oh. So, I know, Ben, that you have supervised more than 50 PhD students, but here stands a very proud one. So, in this manner, a very SOASian journey of intellectual curiosity, searching and researching began that became focused on examining the interactions between the policies, the scholarship, and the rhetoric of the international financial institutions. This prism of separating scholarship, rhetoric, and policies was offered by Ben in his work on shifting moments of neoliberalism. My focus was on the Bretton Woods institutions, and in particular on the World Bank, as main agents in development and main articulators of shifting paradigms of the neoliberal epoch, from the Washington Consensus to the post-Washington Consensus to more recently the Wall Street Consensus, with thanks to our colleague Daniela Gabor for lending a name to this latest and current phase of neoliberalism. The starting point for me was the pernicious impact that the policies of the Bretton Woods institutions often had. The ambition was to unpack the relationships between their policy, scholarship, and rhetoric, and how these in turn related to the material realities in the global south. This would allow to develop critiques of the common sense that the Bretton Woods institutions sought to instill in economic policy making. My research would ultimately hone in on how a key set of imperatives, in particular those around the privatization of public services, mutated as the Bretton Woods institutions responded to the challenges that their neoliberal agenda confronted as it was being rolled out, even if unevenly, across countries and sectors. This combined with an interest in how institutions like the World Bank exercise their power, not only through their financial levers, but importantly via their knowledge role. Indeed, my PhD was entitled Exploring the Emergence of a New Age Regime, Selectivity, Knowledge, and the World Bank, and examined the ways in which the exercise of the World Bank's self-proclaimed knowledge role imply a tight, if not always visible, web of control over policymaking in the poorer countries of the global south. Part of this work found its way in a quoted volume entitled The Political Economy of Development that I put together with Kate Bayliss and Ben Fine, which was published in 2011 by Pluto. A few years after my PhD and 2 children later, I became involved in a large European-funded project that went by the acronym FESUD, which stood for Financialization, Economic Society, and Sustainable Development.
The award was for a multidisciplinary 5-year project that had been granted in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2008 to support social science research into how finance could better serve economic, social, and environmental needs. The project was led from within the University of Leeds, with SOAS playing a significant role, drawing together its multiple networks across Europe and the Global South. I was a co-investigator in a work package that focused on finance, development, and global governance. It was as part of this project that my contributions started to focus on what I coined the private turn in development finance. This drew attention to a fundamental shift in the narratives and practices of development finance, as official development assistance, often referred to as aid, became increasingly tasked with supporting the mobilization of private finance. Indeed, the 1990s and 2000s had seen the rapid, if uneven, expansion of private flows to the Global South, with recurring crises in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and then again in 2008, puncturing their rapid growth. At the same time, the purpose of official development assistance and development cooperation more broadly was redefined. This was driven by the weakening of Northern donors' commitment to the public financing of development, combined with a strong belief and commitment to the potential of private flows. The role of ODA was reoriented as it became designated as key in leveraging private finance for major investments needed for development, including in social and economic infrastructure. This shift towards the private had started to characterize official discourse on development finance from the late 1990s onwards. It became, however, incrementally visible through the outcome documents of the successive United Nations Financing for Development summits. And while these summits were instituted by the UN, they would increasingly bear the mark of the rapidly growing influence of the World Bank and the IMF over the world of development finance. At the first UN summit on financing development in Monterrey, Mexico in 2002, the principle that financing for development was increasingly to be provided through international capital markets became officially adopted by the international community. The idea was that for developing countries to overcome high levels of poverty, they should put in place transparent, stable, and predictable investment climates with the aim of attracting private international capital flows. This required special attention to property rights, business-friendly macroeconomic policies, and institutions. A residual and auxiliary role for aid emerged as part and parcel of the rapid expansion of private financial flows, with an emphasis on ODA's role in capacity or institution building. These ideas were reiterated at the second International Conference for Financing Development in Doha in 2008. If somewhat surprisingly, yet emblematic of the cognitive dissonance that unfortunately sometimes characterizes development discourse, in the midst of the unfolding global financial and economic crisis, the Doha Declaration insisted that there was a persistent need, and I quote, to strengthen national bilateral and multilateral efforts to assist developing countries in overcoming the structural or other constraints which currently limit their attractiveness as a destination for private capital. Such efforts could include the promotion and strengthening of partnerships, including public-private partnerships, unquote. The text continued, and I quote again, the programs, mechanisms, and instruments at the disposal of multilateral development agencies and bilateral donors can be used for encouraging business investment, including by contributing to mitigating some risks faced by private investors. ODA can play a catalytic role in mobilizing private flows, unquote. This redefinition of ODA's role culminated in the outcome document of the third Financing for Development Summit in Addis Ababa in 2015. The famous paragraph 48 of the final outcome document highlighted, and I quote again, that both public and private investment have key roles to play in infrastructure financing, including through tools and mechanisms such as public-private partnerships, blended finance, which combines concessional public finance with non-concessional private finance, unquote. The 2015 document of the third Financing for Development Conference in Addis provided the financing framework for the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which were adopted just a few months later in September 2015 by the United Nations. With ODA or aid falling short of providing the resources necessary to address the SDGs, the Northern donor community then consolidated an approach that increasingly sought to use limited ODA resources as leverage for private capital in financing development in developing countries. The official financing gap to enable the SDGs was to be filled by private resources, with particular enthusiasm for the deployment of public-private partnerships. Indeed, in the run-up to the third Financing for Development Summit in Addis in 2015 July, the World Bank and the IMF had explicitly argued for a transformation of development finance post-2015 by putting the blending or leveraging of aid for private finance at the heart of a new paradigm. In their joint paper entitled From Billions to Trillions, the institutions called for a paradigmatic shift on how development will be financed to unlock the resources needed to achieve the sustainable development goals. The call for action was to go from billions of public development finance to trillions of total development finance by way of scarce public resources mobilizing abundant private resources. In this way, the private sector was given a pivotal role in financing the post-2015 development agenda, with the role of aid redefined explicitly in support of it. This had specifically implications. New instruments of aid became increasingly prominent, in particular through what were called blending mechanisms. One such blending mechanism to become widely promoted was, as already mentioned, the deployment of public-private partnerships, or PPPs, in particular for the delivery of infrastructure or public or essential services like transport, education, health, housing, energy, etc. Indeed, the realm of policy making around infrastructure or public service provision was characterized by particular enthusiasm for the de-risking or blending paradigm, with a rapid increase in the promotion of public-private partnerships as a specific way to mobilize private finance in infrastructure. In this manner, new narratives with regard to infrastructure developed. Private finance came to be seen as essential to increasing infrastructure investment, and barriers to private investment were presented as reasons for infrastructure failings. Or in the words of one advocacy platform, persistent infrastructure needs were partly due to, and I quote, an investment environment that does not incentivize the private sectors to invest sufficiently, unquote. At the G20 summit in April 2017, the Hamburg Principles were adopted. They stipulated that only as a last resort should policymakers look at using public funds to finance infrastructure. Commercial sources of financing for infrastructure should be prioritized. This was formalized in the World Bank's framework of maximizing financing for development, where countries were encouraged to use a particular cascade approach to think through the financing of their infrastructure investments. A plethora of official initiatives emerged seeking to transform developing countries' infrastructure into assets that would attract private sector interest. These included upstream initiatives that entailed changes in the regulatory, legal, financial environment, benchmarking initiatives, the dissemination of project assessment tools to assist governments in project preparation for PPPs, the creation of specific country units to assist in PPP deployment, the construction of country pipelines for PPP investors, etc. Downstream initiatives included specific efforts of leveraging or blending of public and private resources through guarantees of debt, subsidies, viability gap funding, equity stakes, etc. Indeed, as it was recognized that private sector firms seek investment opportunities on the basis of risk-return considerations, the role of the public sector became redefined to encourage such investment by decreasing perceived risk or increasing anticipated returns. Now, in light of these particular changes in narratives and practices around public service provision in the Global South and the elevation of private finance via PPPs in particular as a magic bullet, together with colleagues, we developed an interdisciplinary research program seeking to unpack some of the implications. A range of questions emerged. Why are we seeing such fast promotion of PPPs in light of the evidence of their poor performance in the global north, with the UK being a case in point? Together with Kate Bayliss, we pointed to the role of financial and in particular institutional investors in the massive upscaling of PPP advocacy. What actually are PPPs? Seeking to overcome the biases implied in multiple categorization efforts around whether a particular governance arrangement should be classified as a PPP or not, together with Maria José Romero, we drew attention to the fundamental features of PPPs, linking these back to underlying tendencies of the financialization of infrastructure, as PPPs transform infrastructure into assets that provide stable cash flows to investors. This allowed us to identify a set of pertinent questions that critical PPP research needed to engage with. Which agents are involved in infrastructure or public service provisioning? What regulatory landscapes exist? How are financial flows moving across the chain of infrastructure provision? What public resources are mobilized and for what purpose? What norms of provision come to prevail when private finance is involved in public service provision? How does the need to generate revenue for private investors affect the way in which the infrastructure service is delivered? And what are the equity implications of linking those who seek access to public services, such as a road, a hospital, or education, to shareholders, often in other parts of the world? Another set of questions emerged around the nature of public sector involvement in the leveraging of public resources for private finance. Together with Kate Bayliss and Maria José Romero, we looked more closely at two cases, a hospital in Brazil and a toll road in Senegal, and carefully charted the extensive involvement of the public sector in enabling private financial involvement, raising questions around who in effect is leveraging whom. In light of the relatively weak interest of private finance in infrastructure, in particular in poorer countries, together with Kate, we asked what the effects were of the massive promotion of PPPs on policy landscapes, pointing to the way this agenda served as a wedge that transformed the role and ethos of the state in public service provisioning, even in the absence of actual investment. This was picked up later in a paper with Julia Chukuma and Maria José Romero, when we mapped the pervasive way in which the World Bank's agenda to promote PPPs in health had dramatically altered the health policy landscape across the African continent. I had also previously unpacked in great detail the history of World Bank involvement in housing, pointing to the long genesis of its neoliberal and financializing housing practices. Together with Elaine Unterhalter and Jasmine Gideon, as Jasmine already alluded to, we set up a Grand Challenges research-funded network, which was called EQUIPS, which examined the ways in which PPPs may increase inequalities, with a focus on South Africa, India, and the UK. And we also sought to understand how new forms of accountability, or lack thereof, emerge with PPPs and how these differ from those associated with conventional forms of public provision. And in the context of an ESRC-funded project focused on rebuilding macroeconomics, together with Kate Bayliss and Ben Bowles, we pointed to the blind spot around financialization in macroeconomics, unpacking the implications of changing types of agents in ownership of PPPs in the mature private finance landscape that the UK offers, with a particular interest in private equity investors' practices of value extraction from public service systems of provision and the conundrum that the regulators face. We demonstrated how regulators are caught in an impossible bind in meeting contradictory and contested interests of investors, end users, and the state, which led us to question whether the socially equitable regulation of financialized infrastructure can ever be possible. And this brings me to the current moment, with the 4th International Conference for Financing for Development about to kick off in Seville at the end of this month, where leaders from governments from the entire world, along with international and regional organizations, financial and trade institutions, businesses, civil society, and the United Nations system will gather. The 4th International Conference on Financing for Development has been promoted as a unique opportunity to, and I quote, discuss and agree on measures that would reform international financing at all levels. So, what's the state of play? What are the issues that need urgent attention? 2 decades on, since the private turn in development finance that became further entrenched at each successive Financing for Development Summit from Monterrey to Addis, we are facing a dramatic debt crisis in many countries in the global south. Indeed, the majority of the lower income countries are at significant risk of a debt crisis. The much promoted shift from public billions to private trillions to finance the SDGs has not materialized. On the contrary, the alleged financing gap to achieve the goals has only widened, including as a result of the needs of the climate vulnerable countries. Instead, resources flow disproportionately from poor to rich countries. Indeed, in 2024, a significant part of the countries in the global south spent more on paying off debt than they received from rich countries. In many of these countries, debt service obligations take a larger share of the budget than spending on healthcare, or as translated in a much repeated yet nevertheless terrifying statistic, 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt payments than on health or education. And much of this money now goes in payments towards private creditors. Indeed, over 60% of developing country debt is owed to private creditors, reflecting the results of the trends of rapid expansion of private flows to the global south that I described earlier on. Commenting on these trends, the World Bank chief economist Indermit Gill observed in December 2024 in a blog entitled "For Developing Countries, the Finance Landscape has become a wasteland" that, and I quote, "Since 2022, foreign private creditors have extracted nearly $141 billion more in debt service payments from public sector borrowers in developing economies than they disbursed in new financing." He concluded that the entire billions to trillions agenda, and I quote, had turned out to be a fantasy. These failures of the international financial system and international development cooperation take place against a backdrop of continuously rising inequalities, rapid accelerations in climate vulnerabilities, including in the global south, recurring humanitarian crises, a fragmentation of the international trade system, etc. The need for dramatic reform of the international financial architecture is as urgent as ever, and a truly transformative agenda on international development finance would need to include, among others, a United Nations framework for sovereign debt reform, expansion of concessional lending, reform of the multilateral development banks to reflect the interests of borrowing nations, United Nations framework for international tax cooperation, an upscaling of climate finance, comprehensive measures to regulate private sector finance in the public interest, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, the drafts of the outcome document of FFD4, the fourth summit about to take place in Seville, do not signal that such a transformative development finance agenda is about to take concrete shape. For instance, it seems very unlikely that a UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt Restructuring will be included in the final draft, as we know that it does not have the support of many northern donor countries. Sections of the current draft of the outcome document continue to promote blended finance and private sector engagement with little interest in regulation or safeguard. And it remains unclear how much progress will be made with regard to the UN Tax Convention, to point to just a few key issues that are unlikely to be resolved by the time the final draft of the outcome document is agreed. Multiple stakeholders in civil society have already raised alarm that the upcoming summit may be a once-in-a-lifetime lost opportunity to bring justice into global economic governance via meaningful structural reform. In light of this sober reading, the work of the scholarly community in partnership with progressive administrations, civil society, UN organizations remains crucial. Key questions around accountability, governance, inequality, how to identify and activate levers for transformative change will need to be pursued with enhanced vigor and clarity, both in our research and in our classroom. So I want to close my inaugural with a commendation of the tremendous work that is being delivered by a vibrant community of scholars out there who are engaging with these fundamental questions in an era where we witness aggressive attempts at dismantling multiple forms of solidarity. To my colleagues, I say, keep going. Your work in research and in the classroom has never been more important. Our collective effort, hopefully, will preserve and promote the foundation and advancement of an agenda that seeks to enable more just and equitable outcomes across societies. Thank you.
Thanks, Elisa. That was a tour de force, really. We're going to move on to our second speaker, and here to introduce Antonio Andreoni is Professor Simon Roberts, who is a research professor here at SOAS in the Center for Sustainable Structural Transformation, which is led by Antonio and Hajun Chang. He's also a professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg, where he founded the Center for Competition, Regulation, and Economic Development. He's also an international economic expert, straddling competition economics and industrial development with a focus on sustainable structural transformation in Africa. Simon has been an economics director at the UK Competition and Markets Authority and chief economist of the Competition Commission of South Africa. He has worked extensively and published on issues of industrial development, trade, regional and global value chains, competition and economic regulation. In recent years, he has also established an African market observatory at University of Johannesburg, focusing on agri-food markets in the context of climate change. Simon has been closely involved in the development of competition regimes across Africa, including working on inquiries and cases, and he's testified as an expert witness in a number of major competition cases in South Africa. And here tonight to introduce Antonio to us. Welcome, Simon.
I have an instruction to click
slide.
the next.
Here,
Yeah, it's just there. Huh? Oh no.
Just the cursor. No.
Mm-hmm.
On the keyboard, just do the one.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
I'm using the mouse. Am I right?
I think so.
Sorry.
There you go. Yeah?
Yeah.
That's
okay,
what you
good.
want, right?
Which is my glass of water. This one.
Yes.
Steady myself. It's a great honor to be here, a great pleasure to be here today, to be here to introduce Antonio's inaugural lecture, also to be here to listen to Elisa's wonderful lecture, and to be here at SOAS, which is a really important institution, I think all of us believe. There are so many things I could dwell on introducing Antonio, but I'm going to just touch on a few areas. Antonio has had, in a shortish space of time, because he's quite a bit younger than me, he has had an incredible, stellar academic career already, graduating summa cum laude from his undergraduate and master's degrees, coming to Cambridge to do an MPhil and a PhD, supervised by Hajun Chang. He has a capacity to take on an enormous range of roles. Right now, he's a distinguished visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg in a sister center to ours at the university. He's also an honorary professor at UCL. He's on academic board of Tsinghua University in China, editor of the Journal of Competition and Change, editorial boards of several other journals as well. Extensive publication record. So I'm not going to go through this publication record or his research. I'd rather listen to him in his inaugural lecture. What I'm going to, though, emphasize and highlight are values of collegiality, collaboration, and inquiry, which Antonio embodies. along with boundless enthusiasm. This is really very, very important for me personally, because we've been working together on policy questions in South Africa and other countries in East and Southern Africa. And in the context of the dominant paradigms, this is a very difficult thing to keep going on. So it's difficult to continue. And Antonio comes in to work with us collaboratively, and he says, "Let's do this, and let's look at this, and let's challenge this this policy question." And genuinely, my colleagues and I sometimes we're quite worn down by trying to push these agendas forward. Antonio arrives and he makes an enormous impact. He's made an enormous impact on my own work, and I know I'm actually speaking on behalf of a number of colleagues at the center at the University of Johannesburg about the impact that he has had on their work as well. I've come to know Antonio most through our work together on issues of structural transformation in South Africa. We co-edited a book together with Fiona Tugena and Pamela Mondliwa. Fiona is the SACHI Chair, South African Research Chair in Industrial Development at the University of Johannesburg, a very important scholar, and Pamela Mondliwa is the Head of Research at the Industrial Development Corporation. I think this also embodies Antonio's bridges across development finance institutions which are trying to make a difference, changing the debates and advancing intellectual debates around issues of structural transformation and industrial development. And this was genuinely a collective inquiry in terms of building ideas among the four of us and many co-authors of chapters in that book and the research which led up to this. It was, and Antonio brought enormous insight into this, from history of economic thought right through to applied work, kind of bridging interest in engineering and manufacturing and industrial development. In terms of the inquiry part of it, Antonio is happiest, I think, when he's actually in a factory. I think he's on the floor. Well, actually, I'll say second happiest, because I'm going to come to when I've seen him happiest. He's happiest when he's in a factory. He's looking at actual problems about how processes work, and understanding these processes located in power dynamics and structural questions in the economies in question and in the international markets and production systems in question. And this is evident in a whole range of collaboration and fellowships that Antonio has had over the years. This has included work in countries across the Global South, such as Brazil. And this is where I've seen Antonio at his happiest place, was when, after a long day of very intense engagement and inquiry, we went out clubbing, and Antonio was happiest diving into the middle of a very small bar, and he outlasted, I think, almost everybody there in terms of dancing, literally the night away. So and then he turned up, of course, the next day, and there's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, kind of like, he's there. I think there's a role in some advertising for some batteries there. I want to finish really by turning to the policy relevance, because I think the other thing that Antonio embodies is trying to make ideas and ground ideas in real-world policy challenges. This is something that's very close to our work. We're always trying to look at how this is going to make a difference in terms of actual actions of institutions, investigating companies and their conduct in terms of things like development finance institutions making decisions. And I think this is, obviously so important to be able to have this bridge between academic inquiry and practical engagement with these policy challenges. This is something which clearly motivates the Center for Sustainable Structural Transformation here at SOAS, where I'm lucky to be involved in some of the research streams, together with co-directed by Antonio and Professor Hajun Chang. It's an incredibly important initiative, and there isn't a better place to be than SOAS, and I think it's really benefited from the leadership, I think also recognizing Elisa and Adam and others here. So I think this is really critical at this time. It's really critical given all the challenges that we have, and it's really critical given the obvious challenges of structural change in the context of climate change, but also, massive inequalities and fracturing and undermining of global institutions of solidarity. So it's definitely something we have to keep on working on, and I think it's something where we've got to be able to join the dots between the different areas of research, the different disciplines that are involved. And I'm looking forward to hearing Antonio's inaugural lecture, which is going to cover some of these things. So thank you very much, and join me in welcoming him to give the lecture.
Here we are. Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for being here tonight, especially thanks to those who traveled far to be here. I'm particularly pleased to share this special evening with my colleague and friend Elisa. Over the last 3 years, we have indeed worked together, also with Anna and now Nabel, who are here, for our college and SOAS, side by side. I learned a lot from Elisa, especially what effective leadership is about and how critical it is to preserve our common good in difficult times, especially when we face significant challenges, both internally and externally. I would also like to thank Simon for his generous words and friendship. Over the last 10 years, Simon and other colleagues from South Africa, special mention to Fiona, of course, and Pamela Mundliwa, have given me a second institution and a second home in Johannesburg. I learned from many of them, and in particular from Simon, the importance of nurturing a generation of young researchers across the continent to have lasting impact, not just in research, but also in society and policy. The topic of my lecture tonight is sustainable structural transformation and industrial policy in the 21st century. Industrial policy has reoccupied the center stage in the policy and academic debates in the last several years for different and still very contested reasons. Most of you have come across industrial policy in the context of the geopolitical competition between the three superpowers, in particular, of course, US and China, but also Europe. Others have learned about the need for industrial policy in the context of climate change, especially the need to restructure our economies and industry and make them ecologically sustainable. For most of us working in the regions of the Global South, industrial policy has once again been called upon as the key policy to drive and coordinate the structural transformation of the economy and make such transformation socially inclusive and ecologically compatible. Almost 20 years ago, when I started my research journey at the University of Cambridge, after my economics training in Bologna, industrial policy was not a fashionable topic. Throughout the 80s and the 2000s, with the rise of neoliberalism and the so-called Washington Consensus, industrial policy was delegitimized, at least in the ideological battleground. The ideological confrontation between the supporters and the opposers of industrial policy became unproductive, with different camps refusing even to agree on basic facts, and with debates often being reduced to ideological grandstanding. A few resisted censorship and challenged the mainstream. At Cambridge, I had the privilege to start my research under the mentorship of Ajun Chang, who is here, one of the very few economists who resisted for over 30 plus years, and in doing so created space for many others, myself included. Ajun was atypical even within the Cambridge Keynesian or Marxist tradition that had influenced me through my former supervisor in Bologna, Roberto Scazzieri, and the long-standing Italian Cambridge intellectual connection going back to Sraffa and Pasinetti. Ajun's historical grounding is eclectic and open epistemology, and even more critically, his pragmatic way of looking at development as a process of productive transformation has had a profound impact on my research and way of approaching it. So thanks, June, for all you have done and continue doing for me and for this community. We always joke that Italian and Koreans have lots in common, and I think it's not simply the close family ties, the consumption of garlic, on which Korean win hands down. June has collected the definitive empirical evidence on that. It is also, I think, the vivid memory of fast industrialization shared by the two countries in the last century. Indeed, I believe the research we choose and commit our life to is rooted in who we are, where we come from, and what makes us not simply intellectually curious, but also fundamentally uncomfortable, and with that makes us feeling the urgency for change in society. At the core of my research, there has always been an interest in understanding production as a theoretical problem in economics, but also as a technical, organizational, as well as political matter in development. A few early contributions have looked at these issues and engaged different debates. At the turn of the 21st century, development research witnessed the consolidation of a paradigm centered around individual agency and freedoms and localized processes of change and stable form of change. Within this paradigm, development processes are mainly mediated through markets and enhanced by good governance institutions. Neoclassical economics, as well as humanist approaches to development advanced by Amartya Sen, among others, provide theoretical foundation to this paradigm. The Millennium Development Goals Agenda for 2000-2015 was a clear manifestation of this established consensus at the turn of the century. Aligning with the liberal tradition, these theories has promoted research in development policies and implementation of institutional market failure fixes that deliberately avoid direct engagement with production, collective capabilities, the political economy of structural transformation, the developmental role of the state, and the full reality and materiality of development in context. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, both production and industrial policies started resurfacing the academic and policy debates. While industrial policy was back in even for the economist. In reality, industrial policy never disappeared. In the post-powerful nation, it was simply implemented in disguise. In the USA, for example, a government report of the 80s stressed how Japan's rate of industrial progress and stated economic goals should be as shocking to Americans as was Sputnik, and that the government should do something to contain the rise of Japan. The same exact rhetoric that has been used to describe the so-called Chinese threat these very days. The two volumes published in 1980 and 2010 prove the point. You see in the first cover the Japanese and German flag, and later on the concern about the industrialization across the US and the Chinese threat. Europe also used industrial policy before the financial crisis. However, since the Lisbon Agenda of 2000, it was mainly focused on innovation policy. It was only in the case of the majority, but not all, of the weaker economies between the 80s and the 2000 and 2010 that industrial policy was massively scaled down, if not completely abandoned. Most developing countries did not have neither the policy and fiscal space or the domestic political economy conditions and capabilities to implement industrial policy effectively. In the early 2010s, deindustrialization, a structural deficit in the US, the austerity response to the global financial crisis in Europe, and China's industrialization miracle were the main drivers of a new wave of industrial policy. However, during this period, industrial policy and trade policy that would disrupt international trade remained largely on the side. Throughout this period, China was still perceived as a catching-up nation whose cheap export played an important role in sustaining the level of domestic consumption in the US. Similarly, the EU had no interest in compromising its trade relationship with China, the main destination market for its manufacturing industries. In the EU, however, the prolonged financial crisis opened new divides between the northern and southern countries, with macroeconomic austerity reinforcing the north-south imbalances and further pushing deindustrialization in southern Europe. The relationship with China played also into this divide, with countries like Germany benefiting from easy access to the Chinese market and southern European countries with a low-medium tech industrial base experiencing fast industrialization due to Chinese imports. My own country, Italy, lost 1/4 of its industrial output and with that, a significant amount of jobs. At the end of my PhD in 2013, when I joined the Institute for Manufacturing in the engineering department at Cambridge University as a postdoctoral fellow, suddenly the demand for industrial policy expertise and industrial production went through the roof. In the UK, many of us will remember the call for rebalancing the economy and the cry for a productivity crisis. In these early years, alongside exceptional colleagues and friends, some of them engineers and scientists, Professor Mike Gregory, Dr. Owen O'Sullivan, and others, I started focusing on the industrialization and how to drive industrial diversification and economic renewal in mature industrial economies, which had gone through the industrialization. This led me in two directions. The first was to understand how industrial ecosystems anchored around regions manage to create value through technological innovation, capture value along global value chains, and distribute value in the broader society. I went back to the Emilia-Romagna region, where Bologna is and where I studied. Historically, this region has been a laboratory for industrial development and regional industrial policy. The so-called Third Italy model became internationally famous in the 70s, 80s, and 90s for its socio-political embedding and its capacity of innovating organizationally and delivering social well-being. The two industries I focused on were the medical device industry and the automotive sector. The automation sector. Both of them became more fashionable later for different reasons. In particular, during the pandemic, we discovered the importance of producing medical device, and later on, of course, the discussion around the impact of automation on jobs. The second research stream on financialization was inspired by early engagement with Professor William Lazonic, in particular around the way in which the financialization of productive organizations undermine their capacity to innovative and sustaining processes of collective learning. In 2016, with funding from the Gatsby Foundation, we embarked in a study of financialization in UK Big Pharma. You will recognize here the name of AstraZeneca, and the graph shows actually its high financialization throughout the 90s and its recent turning around. Since the 1990s, many productive sectors in the US and UK in particular have been dramatically weakened by the financialization of their companies, to the extent that, in particular in the US, the recent use of industrial policy has proven ineffective. Financialization practices have also been spreading across the global south. For example, South Africa is a country with the largest stock among middle-income countries as a share of GDP, but one of the lowest investment rate among the same group. Both these streams of work found a natural home at SOAS when I first joined in 2014. The SOAS Economics Department counts among its founders Edith Penrose, a leading scholar of the growth of the firm. Edith was also a key contributor to the development economics field, with seminal work across different industries in the global south. Here at SOAS, we celebrate this legacy with an annual lecture. Over the last 10 years, in my own research, I developed projects cutting across industries and places in the global north and increasingly in the global south. Again, SOAS was a particularly conducive place to develop such research on firms, sectors, and broader structural transformation in the global south. Following from early research in Tanzania in 2011 and in South Africa in 2014, I was particularly interested in understanding what was preventing effective industrial policy implementation in low and middle-income countries and how to drive their structural transformation. Indeed, in most of these countries, the gap between aspirations and implementation is still enormous. Structural transformation is not simply about changing the material and productive basis of the economy. It is also about changing and challenging its power distribution. When low and middle-income countries try to design, implement, and enforce industrial policy, they are effectively trying to change power structure at their material sources. This is why industrial policy is a complex process which requires blending economics, political economy, and engineering knowledge of industries, technologies, and infrastructures. Often, political, feasible solution can only be found when we look close enough. In 2016, here at SOAS, with Mushtaq Khan and Pallavi Roy, we led the first anti-corruption evidence research consortium funded by the FID. This program gave me the opportunity to look sector by sector at the complex political economy of production and how to make industrial policy feasible in adverse context. In Tanzania, we looked at policy-sensitive commodities like rice and sugar, the implementation of firms' incentives within special economic zone, the energy sector, the health system, the skills sector, and so on. My own work further developed in South Africa. In 2016, Fiona Tregenna invited me to join the University of Johannesburg as a visiting professor at SARCI to embark on a research program focusing on structural transformation in collaboration with CRED, a center that, of course, was funded by Simon. This led to a wide range of collaborations and a volume bringing together work across several sectors, including mining equipment, automotive, food, etc. In fact, the cover of this book is from a company we work with in the Gauteng region. Most of this work also developed in comparative analysis across Brazil and other countries in the middle-income group. I would like to use this opportunity to thank all research partners at SOAS, UJ, and beyond, some of them here tonight, for the companionship and the passion you have thrown into this kind of work. I would also like to add a special thanks to my PhD students who started following me, yes, visiting shop floor sometimes, and also government departments, broader engagement with society. I learned from each one of you, thanks to Inka, Sofia, Gwendalina, Julian, Adria, Matt, Kino, Fausto, and Luis. I never offered you the easiest path, but your success proved me that it was worth our collective effort. Throughout the second half of the last decade, while I was busy working in Southern and East Africa, the industrial policy debate reached another turning point. In 2015, the Paris Agreement backed climate change into the global policy debate, although the way in which it was turned into policy practice differed across the major economies. In the EU, the industrial policy acquired a new meaning as the main tool to drive the greening of the economy. The European Green Deal was, at the beginning, an important step for the introduction of ambitious transition goals for the continent and major implication in terms of the restructuring of domestic industries. The deal incorporated the international dimensions mainly from a regulatory point of view, that is the need to avoid unfair competition from polluting nations. Industrial policy in the US and China follow a different path. Also in 2015, China launched a new industrial policy strategy with the ambition for global leadership in industry and technology, the Made in China 2025. Already in the early 2000, and with an acceleration in the first half of 2010, with the rise of Xi Jinping, China had incrementally and persistently upgraded its industrial policy goals. China had launched the first green industrial policy for renewable energy generation in the early 2000s, and by mid-2010 was already capable of generating more green energy than all other countries in the world combined. China's world share of gross production followed an unprecedented path, surpassing Germany in 1998, Japan in 2005, and US in 2008. Since 2008, China has more than doubled its world share. The US share has fallen by another 3%, and in 2023, China's share has overtaken the combined share of the other 9 largest manufacturing countries. Partly thanks to the Belt and Road Initiative, by 2015, China had become the first commercial partner of most developing countries. Over the last few years, as an invited member at Tsinghua University of the Center for Industrial Development and Environmental Governance, CIDEG, I had the opportunity to see firsthand such tremendous transformation and conducting research, in particular on robotization in China. And here you can see some of the regions that we've been looking at in terms of development and uptake of the technology. In the US, during the first Trump administration and in the Biden administration, China's rise was increasingly reframed as a threat to the US national security. New measures concerning specific products, technologies, and key Chinese companies like Huawei were introduced during this period. The first Trump administration was the first to introduce a large array of protectionist measures, largely retained under the Biden administration. The latter, exploiting the new policy windows opened by the 2020 pandemic, managed to introduce and justify a new bundle of industrial policy instruments. Here you can see some of them, even though they were deliberately not called industrial policy. They were called Defense Act, CHIPS Act, Critical Minerals Act, Inflation Reduction Act, and so on. No measure was taken by the Biden administration, however, to restrain widespread financialization of non-financial corporations like Boeing in the US. In response to this turn in the US, the EU introduced several other industrial policies. I personally spent a year as an advisor at the EU DG GROW, looking at the unfolding of the Next Generation EU, introducing response to the COVID pandemic, and the Repower Europe, introduced as a response to the Ukrainian war. The new reconfiguration of global alliances following the US-China confrontations, both in terms of geopolitics and over the control of key digital and renewable technologies, including the access to the minerals critical for these technologies, have highlighted the conflict dimensions of industrial policy and the risk of a fallacy of composition at the global level. Indeed, this is the first time since the US and Germany, to a less extent, challenged to the UK in the 19th century, that the global economy has 2 major powers capable of competing for the position of hegemon in the international economic order. It is also the first time the old continent, Europe, is largely marginalized and play a more reactive role. We have entered dangerous times. Antonio Gramsci famously wrote, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." Trump's tariff war is one of these phenomena, and indeed the ultimate manifestation of the crisis of the hegemon. Climate change denialism in the US and increasing pressure from certain political parties to weaken climate change targets in Europe and the UK are again other morbid phenomena. Even in some developing countries who have been disproportionately affected by climate change, we have witnessed cases in which anti-climate change arguments were used to protect rent's position, even when green investment would have improved development outcome. This crisis presents challenges, but also opens opportunities across the global south. Looking at these challenges and opportunities requires a good dose of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, to quote again Gramsci. In 2024, with Ajun Chang, we set up the Center for Sustainable Structural Transformation, is quite of a mouthful, to reimagine and promote structural transformation in an age of ecological and social crisis through industrial policy that is long-term oriented and frame-shifting. It was also an effort to bring together an invisible network of economists who have promoted industrial policy for sustainable prosperity over many years. We are delighted to have Richard Kosurwright, who is here with us, and other friends joining our center to promote this research and policy engagement, and even more critically, to create a new group of scholars. And I see some of you here, so great to see Arnaud, Jean, Carl, and many of you there. I would like to use this opportunity to thank our funders, Hyundai Motor Group, TLCom, Gatsby Africa, and recently OSF, to support this effort. We call this center Sustainable Structural Transformation to convey the message that this is not simply about greening. It is about reframing development in industrial policy for the 21st century. Structural transformation is necessary to sustain economic growth and to drive virtuous cycle of transformative change encompassing the productive, social, institutional, and political economy of countries. It is even more imperative in green economic transformation, cutting across energy, industry, mobility, and agri-food systems. Our recent work on reindustrialization in South Africa have indeed highlighted the need to link renewable energy, market regulation, infrastructure investment, and productive sector development. The main transformative processes through which structural transformation delivers equitable and sustainable prosperity are the building up and accumulation of productive technological and organizational capabilities, resulting in innovative and ecologically sustainable industrial ecosystem. The creation of good jobs and their continuous betterment through formalization, unionization, and skills development, resulting in better livelihood and social mobility. And thirdly, investments of system of welfare provision that increase inclusiveness and resilience of society and critically contribute to state legitimization. These transformative processes do not emerge spontaneously. They must be directed, governed, and shaped to address immediate and long-term needs. New pathways need to be opened and barriers to entry removed, markets and institutions created. Trade-off and conflicting claims must be managed along the way via the coordination of industrial, energy, competition, fiscal and welfare policies, to mention but a few. Against this backdrop, governments cannot think about goals and problems in silos and need to focus on how to establish a virtuous loop between economic, social, and ecological imperatives. In this respect, industrial policy is the main economic policy of a developmental state. It is not a policy to be relegated or owned by one ministry or department alone. The opening of a policy space at the international level, as it is happening now, will be only useful if domestic political economy challenges and fragmented politics are overcome. A strategic industrial policy, production-centered industrial policy for the 21st century is needed more than ever to drive productivity, to change the capability set, and to coordinate transformative changes within and across sectors in most low and middle-income countries. In many of these countries, including South Africa, where I have the honor to sit in the Presidential Economic Advisory Council with Alan here as well, Alan Hirsch, and other colleagues, often the industrial policy debate gets stuck in unproductive confrontation and false dichotomies, such as export-led versus import substitution, manufacturing versus services, green versus brown industries, large versus small companies. These dichotomies make governments overplaying trade-off, reinforce a silos mentality, and make difficult to focus on virtuous loop connecting economic, social, and ecological imperatives. These debates also distract from the fact that industrial policy is ultimately about nurturing, steering, and shaping a process of learning that result in higher productivity, higher competitiveness, resilience, and readiness to change. Learning mainly happens in productive organization and institution, not in markets. And this is also where capabilities get developed and accumulated. The recent pandemic has proved once more that the materiality of development matters and that distributed production capabilities are needed to face increasingly uncertain times. Climate change is opening new windows of opportunities for transforming several industries, in particular root industry. This is just showing you some of the work we've been doing in trying to frame this kind of opportunities. Generating new employment as well as injecting technological change into sector central to many low and middle income countries like South Africa. Upstream and downstream linkages running vertically and horizontally between energy, minerals, and industrial sector can be leveraged to drive domestic industrialization, create new employment, and spur diffusion on green technologies. The window to address climate change is, however, rapidly closing. Investment decisions or lack of decision in key sectors like steel, chemicals, mobility, and energy today affect the long-term ecological viability of our economies and societies. The investment will be only unlocked if powerful industrial policies are effectively implemented. Climate change, persistent inequalities, and lack of structural transformation in the Global South is also a major call for academia. Academia can play a very important role if all its parts rise to the ambition and challenges we are facing. I met many colleagues here at SOAS and in many other institutions who share this ambition, and they are tirelessly working to address these challenges. I would like to thank each one of you for contributing to this collective effort. I would like to come to a close to thank all of you here tonight, and in particular my parents, Franco and Grazia Maria, my sister Monica and my partner Mes, who have supported me throughout this journey over the years. I know it has felt more like a roller coaster, and I know I keep saying that I will slow down at some point. I will, but not yet. Thanks.